My mother laughed into the microphone and told a room full of people that I was not even family, as if she had just shared a clever toast, and not a personal execution, and the laughter that followed hit me like a wall of glass, some guests raising their champagne glasses, others chuckling politely, while I sat frozen in place, burning from the inside out. But I stood slowly, legs stiff, hands cold still. I raised my own glass, looked her in the eye, and said fine, then stop asking me for money, and the room dropped into a silence so hard it cracked the air. My father blinked, stunned. My mother's grin shattered, and the sparkle of the chandeliers seemed suddenly too bright, too harsh. My name is Jordan, and I was 29 years old, a forensic accountant in Atlanta, one of the top ones in the field, but my family thought I was a broke bookkeeper, unaware that for 5 years I had been paying the mortgage, their utilities, even their credit card minimums. And what you are about to hear is how I dismantled their whole fantasy world in one night, starting with a party that felt more like a setup than a celebration. The humid Atlanta evening clung to my skin as I pulled up to the Piedmont Club. My 5-year-old silver Volvo, reliable, modest, paid in cash and embarrassingly out of place between Bentleys and G-Wagons. The valet, a bored-looking kid, barely glanced at me as I handed over the keys, and I smoothed down my blazer straight from the airport, still tired from a 3-day audit in Houston, where I had cracked a multi-million-dollar embezzlement case for an oil company. I should have been resting. I should have been anywhere else, but this was my father Luther's 60th birthday, and my mother Beatrice had made it clear that attendance was non-negotiable. The Piedmont Club was where new money came to pretend it was old money, and my parents loved it more than they loved reality. Before I even reached the grand entrance, Tiffany, my sister-in-law, materialized like a bad omen in a shimmering silver gown, with her blonde hair piled high and her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, Jordan, you made it," she purred, as if I had stumbled in by accident, not on purpose, her voice laced with sugary venom. "I almost thought you would not come. But then I saw that little car outside, and I just knew," and I nodded, not giving her the reaction she wanted. "Happy birthday to Dad," I said calmly. She gave me the once over, her eyes landing on my navy blue pantsuit, tailored Italian wool, quiet luxury, something elegant that whispered instead of screamed. But in Tiffany's world, if it did not shine or shout, it was invisible. "Honey," she said in a tone usually reserved for toddlers, "did you not read the invitation? It said black tie. You look like you are here to check coats or maybe bus tables. It is a little embarrassing for Dante, you know. He really wanted everything perfect tonight." I smiled tight, clenching my purse. I had worked with the FBI last month, helping trace a shell corporation through 3 countries. But Tiffany thought I was a sad office clerk, just another way, she reminded me. I was not one of them. I came straight from work. I said did not have time to change into a costume. She laughed, the kind of laugh that sounded like a warning. "You are so defensive, Jordan," she chirped. "We will try to keep you out of the official photos. We want the aesthetic to be clean. Mom would hate for things to look cluttered." And with that, she turned and floated inside on a wave of perfume. I stood for a second, letting the jazz music leaking through the doors brace me like a wind tunnel. I could have left, could have gotten in my car, driven back to Buckhead to my penthouse, and watched a movie, but some part of me still believed this night might be different. Maybe the 60th year brought clarity. I pushed the doors open and stepped into a ballroom that looked like a wealthy person's hallucination. Chandeliers, floral centerpieces, a band too loud to enjoy. It was everything my mother believed rich meant in the center of the chaos. My brother Dante stood like a king in a too-tight white tux jacket, flashing a gold chain thick as a bike lock. From across the room I could tell the chain was plated, not real, and I knew Dante's finances better than he did because I had been the one quietly keeping them afloat for years. Next to him was my father, looking like a man trying hard to appear in control, and beside him my mother, glowing in a bright red dress, pearls around her neck, face lit up with the kind of joy reserved for people in denial. I moved through the crowd, nodding at distant cousins and church friends until I reached the family circle. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, slipping between 2 uncles. Luther looked up and frowned slightly. "Jordan, you are late." "I had a flight," I said. "I told Mom I would be here by 7. It is 7:15, Beatrice said, scanning my outfit like it was a crime. "Well, you are here now. Honestly, Jordan, you could have tried harder. Look at Dante, look at Tiffany. They understand how to respect the occasion." She waved at Dante, who was bragging about his fake Rolex to a group of men Submariner, he said, had to treat myself for all the big winds coming up, you know how it is. I saw the bezel was crooked, and the second hand ticked instead of sweeping cheap replica. But the men around him nodded along. Nice watch, Dante, I said flatly. He grinned. Thanks, sis, you should ditch that apple. Watch get something with ice, lets people know you are a baller. Bookkeeping does not pay like music, right? He laughed, and my mother laughed too. Oh, Dante, stop teasing your sister, Beatrice said, clearly enjoying it. Jordan loves her little job. It is safe. Not everyone can be a visionary like you. I bit my cheek, remembering the $20,000 retainer I had just been paid by a bank to investigate internal fraud. But to them I was the frugal math nerd, the one who never got the big picture. Why don't you go find your seat? Tiffany said, arriving with a glass of champagne that she did not offer me. Dinner is about to start. I looked at the head table, set for 6, Mom, Dad, Dante, Tiffany, the pastor and his wife. There was no place card for me. Where am I sitting? I asked. Oh, we had to shuffle some things, Beatrice said, gesturing vaguely toward the back. Pastor Jenkins needed a seat. We figured you would not mind. You are at table 9. I turned. Table 9 was next to the kitchen doors, the table for the help, the kids, the elderly too fragile to complain. I nodded tight. Because family means so much to you, do not start, Luther warned, his cheer peeling off like old paint. Just sit and behave. It is my birthday. I walked to the back, heels echoing across the floor. Table 9 was a folding table covered with a tablecloth that did not match the others. Beside me was Aunt Hattie, mostly deaf, and across from me, a 4-year-old smearing butter on the cloth. From where I sat I could see the entire party. Beatrice whispering to the pastor about Dante's bright future, waiters gliding around the head table, topping off wine glasses, untouched, Luther basking in his illusion. And from this distance I could also hear them clearly when Luther leaned in and said, Pastor, we are just so blessed Dante is on the edge of something huge, and Tiffany, her family is pure gold. And your daughter? The pastor asked politely. Luther chuckled, waved his hand. Jordan, she is fine. She struggles very tight with money. We try to help her, stubborn, though keeps her grandfather's ways, but none of his warmth, a bit of a burden. Honestly, we love her, but she just does not belong in a family like ours. I stared at my untouched bread roll. Burden. I was the one who paid off their overdue car note last winter. I was the one who transferred $2,000 every month, labeled as consulting, so Luther's pride would stay intact. And now I was a charity case. The waiter bumped me with a tray as he passed, and I flinched not from the contact, but from the wave of clarity. Table 9 had plastic cups, while the others had crystal carafes. It was petty, calculated, an insult from someone who could not slap me in public, but could make sure I knew my place. My dinner companions were toddlers and retirees. I was not family. I was set dressing. I watched Luther raise his glass, Dante slapping his back, Beatrice glowing as Dante handed him a gold envelope. Inside it, a color printout of an imaginary trip to Europe, Paris, Rome, London, first class. Dante announced. The room cheered. Tiffany dabbed her eyes. Beatrice wept. Luther hugged his son, shaking from emotion. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that the trip was fake. The booking was never made. The funds did not exist. It was a fantasy printed on glossy paper. And that was enough. Then the MC said my name, and it was my turn. I carried a heavy white gift bag to the head table. The room quieted. Luther wiped his eyes, already shifting from joyful to suspicious. I placed the box in front of him. Inside was 6 months' worth of clinical supplements the doctor had said were vital, the ones his insurance denied, and the platinum membership card for the Emory Heart Unit. $4,000 out of my pocket. Medicine, Luther said, confused. You got me medicine. Before I could speak, Beatrice snatched the box, her face twisted. Jordan, she barked, you bring pills on his birthday. Dante gives him the Eiffel Tower, and you bring sickness. She flung the box, the bottles scattering across the floor. You want him to die, she screamed. Are you trying to kill him, to curse this night? I stood frozen, and the guests stared in horror. No one moved. Tiffany was laughing, Dante smirking, Luther stunned, and my mother was standing in front of the world, declaring that I was the villain, that I wanted my father dead because I dared bring him what he actually needed. And I knew in that moment that the last thread connecting me to this family had snapped clean, and I was finally free. When the final bottle clinked against the marble floor and rolled to a stop, I looked around expecting anyone to say something, but they all just stared as if they were watching an accident on the highway, unable to look away but unwilling to help, and my mother stood tall in her rage hand, trembling as she hissed, "You are not even family," and the silence that followed did not feel like silence at all. It felt like a scream stretching across the chandeliers, the music, the fake smiles, and something inside me snapped so cleanly I could feel it like glass cracking in my chest, and I turned without a word and walked back to table 9, each step heavy and slow and echoing the sound of heels on polished tile like drumbeats of humiliation. Aunt Hattie asked what happened, but I just shook my head as the toddler beside me pointed at a breadstick and laughed, unaware of the war that had just begun. Upstairs, they resumed the party, pretending nothing happened. A new song played louder, glasses clinked again, and I watched Tiffany lean over and whisper to a woman beside her, who turned to look at me, then turned back, laughing into her wine. And my father never looked my way once he raised his glass to Dante, toasted his future, and I knew I was done begging for recognition that would never come. When the cake came out, 5 tiers white gold fondant with real orchids, and a tiny fondant Dante at the top, holding a microphone. People gasped and clapped, and I realized they were celebrating a fantasy built on debt, lies, and delusion, and I was the only one who knew the truth, and the only one being punished for it. After the party, as people began to leave, I waited until the room thinned out, and then stood and walked toward the main table. Tiffany saw me first, her eyes narrowing, and she reached for Dante's arm, but I walked past them and straight to Beatrice, who was dabbing her forehead with a linen napkin like she had just survived a fire bomb. I said. She turned slowly, expression blank. "What you did up there was cruel and uncalled for, and I want you to know that I see it now. I see all of it. You never wanted me here, not just at this party. I mean in this family. I was convenient when you needed money or help, but the moment I wanted respect, I became a problem." "Jordan," she said, smiling tight, "not now. We are tired, and we have guests to say good bye to. Maybe you should go home. You are upset and being dramatic. You have always been sensitive." I nodded. "Yes, I am sensitive because I thought I mattered to you." She scoffed. "You do in your way. But let's be honest, you are not like us. You never were. You are too serious, too cold. You never bring anyone around you act like we are beneath you." I opened my mouth, but she kept going. "Your father and I tried, but you are just difficult. And no one likes to walk on eggshells around you. Your brother is easy. He brings people together. He makes us laugh. You bring tension. You make things harder than they need to be. And frankly, your attitude tonight has been exhausting. So yes, maybe you should take a break from all of us and figure out what you really want." I looked at her, not blinking, the room spinning around, her voice muffled like it was coming through water. And I said, "Fine, I will take that break, and you can figure out what it is like without me for once." And I turned and walked away, my heart pounding, not with sadness but with relief, like something heavy had just been peeled off my chest. I left the Piedmont Club and walked down the sidewalk, heels clicking under the streetlights, the night warm and sticky. But I felt cold, so cold I called a rideshare instead of waiting for the valet, and sat on the curb until it arrived. And as I rode back to my apartment overlooking Peachtree Street, I stared out the window, not at the lights or the traffic, but at my own reflection, and I thought about how many years I had spent twisting myself into a shape small enough to fit their vision of me, and how I had paid the price over and over for their mistakes, and how I had believed that maybe, just maybe, one day they would say thank you, but the truth was they never saw me at all. And when I got home, I did not cry. I poured a glass of water, stood on my balcony, and watched the city breathe beneath me, and I made a decision. I was going to untangle myself from them completely, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of necessity, and that meant money too. The next morning I drafted an email, subject line, "Consulting Discontinuation," and I wrote, "Deal Luther, as of today, I will no longer be offering financial support disguised as consulting services. I have carried this family's debts, expenses, and emergencies on my shoulders for 5 years, and it has only deepened the disrespect and distance between us. I wish you and your household peace, but I will no longer finance delusion, Jordan." And I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I logged into my bank app and canceled every automatic for every backup payment, every card I had given them access to, and I closed the joint account that I had opened for emergencies, the one they used like a piggy bank, and I felt a little lighter. Then I opened my files and began pulling receipts, tax records, transfers, screenshots, building a folder labeled just in case. Then I got dressed and went to work, where I was welcomed with smiles, high fives, and a Starbucks waiting on my desk from my assistant, who had no idea what kind of war I had just stepped into. By noon, I was deep into a forensic audit of a company's inventory discrepancies, and the numbers calmed me. They made sense. Numbers never lied, never played favorites. And as I built a pattern of fraud leading to a warehouse manager skimming from shipments, I felt something like power settle into my bones again. I went home that night, made myself dinner, poured a glass of wine, and watched a documentary about art theft. And when my phone buzzed at 9:15, it was a text from Tiffany. "Hey, just a heads up, Dante says Dad's card got declined at the gas station. Did you mess something up?" I stared at the message, laughed once, and typed back, "Tell Dante to try his own card this time." She responded with a string of angry emojis, and I put my phone on silent. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th day, my father called twice. I let it ring. On the 5th day, Beatrice called. I ignored it too. Then came the text, "Jordan, we need to talk," from Luther. "Jordan, please call me," from Dante. And finally one from an unknown number. "Jordan, this is Pastor Jenkins. I think your family is struggling and needs your grace." And I stared at it for a full minute before deleting it. And that weekend, I flew to New York to meet with a client who ran a startup specializing in blockchain verification for art sales. And while I was walking through the Guggenheim with her talking about digital fingerprinting, my phone rang again, and I let it ring, and I smiled. And I knew I was not going back. Then Monday morning, I got an email from Tiffany with the subject line, "Urgent," and all caps, "Jordan, the utilities are off. They shut off the gas, and Mom is freaking out. You need to fix this now." And I stared at that email for a full 5 minutes before replying, "I do not need to do anything. Best of luck." And I sent it and blocked her, and the silence that followed was delicious. They went from ignoring me to needing me in under a week, and I did not lift a finger. And I remembered every time they had told me I was too cold, too distant, too harsh for not giving them more. And now that I had given them nothing, they realized what I had been holding up. And then on Wednesday, the email came from my father, and it said, "Jordan, I know things got messy at the party, and I want to apologize if we made you feel less than you are. We love you. Your mother loves you. She just has a hard time expressing it. Please, let us talk. Please consider coming to the house for dinner Friday, just us." And I read it and reread it and felt nothing, not anger, not hope, just a blank space where need used to live. And I closed the laptop and went for a walk past the bookstore, the coffee shop, and into the park where the trees had started to turn gold. And I sat on a bench and breathed, and for the first time in years I realized I was living my life, not reacting to theirs, and it felt good, really good. When Friday night came and I did not show up for dinner, there was a shift in the wind, something my family could not name or predict, but they felt it, and I felt it too from the moment I looked at my silent phone and chose not to open their latest string of messages. There was no drama, just absence, the kind that echoes louder than shouting. And I spent that evening in sweatpants watching a Korean crime series and eating dumplings straight from the pan while the city buzzed beyond my windows. And somewhere across town in the house I used to help pay for, they sat waiting, plates getting cold, and I did not care. On Saturday, Luther called 5 times in a row, then left a voicemail saying, "Jordan, come on. This is not how family works. We had a little blow up. It happens. You are still our girl. Come home. We will talk it out." And I stared at the screen and thought, no, I will never be your girl again. Then Sunday afternoon, the first serious play came not from my parents, but from Dante. It was a screen shot sent through a text showing a final notice from the mortgage company, past due amount red and bold, and the caption read, "Please, Jordan, just help me get this reset. You know, I will pay you back." And I let the message sit. I thought about all the times I had given Dante money only for him to brag about bottle service and expensive belts, and I remembered his graduation when I bought him a used Lexus with my bonus, and he told people he got it from our dad, and I remembered the way he looked through me at that party like I was in the way, and I deleted the message without replying. That night I got a call from my Aunt Lydia, the one relative who had always been kind to me. She said, "Sweetie, I do not know what is going on, but your mamma is acting like a ghost. She is pacing the kitchen all day. Your father is cranky and blaming the thermostat, and they have not said anything clear, but baby, I think you broke something." And I said I did not break anything, I just stopped patching the holes, and she sighed and said, "Well, I hope they get their heads on straight, because it is quiet over there, and not the good kind of quiet." And I thanked her and changed the topic. And after the call I took a bath with eucalyptus oil and lit a candle and lay there thinking about all the times I had drowned in that family, trying to keep them afloat. On Monday I went back to work, and during lunch I got a ping from our payroll officer asking if I had changed my withholding status because someone had called pretending to be me trying to redirect my check, and I froze, then responded with every protocol and security procedure I knew, and we traced the number, and it came from a line registered under a company Dante had once created during his crypto phase. And I sat at my desk, heart pounding and jaw locked, and I realized this was not a tantrum, this was warfare. They were trying to manipulate my money to force me back, and I was done playing polite, so I opened my legal insurance portal and requested a consult. By that evening I was on the phone with a lawyer named Elise, who listened carefully and said, "It is time to draw boundaries with paperwork." And I said, "Do whatever you have to." And we began drafting notices and access revocations, and I sent a cease and desist to Dante, which made him furious, and he left me a voicemail saying, "You are taking this too far, you think you are better than us, and now you are acting like a stranger." And I did not respond. Then came the group text: Beatrice, Luther, Dante, Tiffany, and a few cousins I had not spoken to since 2009, and it read, "We are having a family meeting this Sunday at 3. You are expected to attend." And I laughed out loud in my kitchen while making tea, and I typed back, "I do not attend events organized by people who call me not family." And I left it at that. Saturday came with a knock at my door. It was Luther, and he looked tired in a way I had never seen, like something had been peeled away from his face. And he said, "Jordan, I know things went left, but can we talk?" And I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. He stood with his hands in his pockets looking down the hallway, and said, "Your mother is not well. She has been quite moody, not sleeping, and I think you shook her with your walkout." And I said I did not walk out, I was pushed, and he nodded. "Maybe, but it has been hard here, and I know we have not always shown it, but we love you and we want peace." I asked, "Did you call and pretend to be me to my job?" And his eyes flicked up, then away, and I knew the answer, and I said, "That is not peace, that is fraud, and I will not play games anymore." And he said, "Your mother, Mrs. Yu," and I said, "Does she miss me? Or does she miss my money?" And he flinched like I had slapped him. And I added, "I am done fixing your fires, and I will not be your safety net anymore." And he nodded slowly, turned, and walked away. And that night I got another message from Aunt Lydia, who said, "Baby, your mom is sitting on the porch in her robe. It is cold, and she has not moved for 2 hours." And I said, "Tell her to go inside, or she will get sick." And Lydia said she will not listen to me, and I said she is not listening to anyone, not even herself. And I turned off my phone and went to sleep. The next morning a car pulled up in front of my building, and I saw Tiffany get out in heels and sunglasses. She buzzed my apartment and said, "I just want to talk," and I let her up. She came in, looked around, said, "Still got your little ice box, I see." And I said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Mama is spiraling, Jordan. She is not talking. She burned a pot of beans and started crying, and then went to bed and has not gotten up since. I know she hurt you, but this is not it. This is not you punishing her into silence." And I said, "I am not punishing anyone. I am healing. And if that hurts them, maybe they should ask why." And she said, "They are afraid." And I said they should be afraid of losing the only person who ever held them together. And she sat on my couch and said, "We are not whole without you." And I said, "Maybe you should learn how to be whole on your own." And she said, "You used to care." And I said, "I still care, but I care about myself now too." And I told her I needed space, and she left quietly, and I knew she understood a little bit. And Sunday came and went, and I did not show up. And Monday brought silence, and Tuesday a letter came handwritten from Beatrice, the first letter she had written me since summer camp in 2002. It said, "Jordan, I do not know how to fix this, but I miss you. I was wrong, and I am scared. Please call me Love Mama." And I read it twice and said it down and felt a strange twist in my stomach, like grief and justice were shaking hands, and I did not cry, but I sat still for a long time and thought about how far I had come and how far I still had to go, and I whispered to myself, "I will not go back, I will only move forward," and I meant it. "This is spelled wrong," I said quietly, holding the piece of paper between my fingers, and then I looked at the stamp again with narrowed eyes because I was pretty sure I had seen the same exact stamp in a discount bin at a stationery store last month and not in any medical billing office, and the more I stared at the paper, the more I noticed how off it felt. The fonts were mismatched, the numbers were round and suspiciously even, and the total amount circled in red looked like something a high school student would fake for a prank assignment. "This is not a hospital invoice," I said, finally lifting my eyes to the man in the white coat who was already starting to step back, his hands lifting as if warding off a blow. "This is a forgery, and a lazy one," I added. The man who had introduced himself as Dr. Marcus raised both palms and looked around nervously. "Now hold on, Miss Jenkins. I think there's been some kind of mix-up. Maybe I grabbed the wrong chart, maybe someone else handled that invoice." But I did not let him finish. "There is no chart, and there is no surgery. And unless you want me to call the real administration of this hospital and ask why a man who looks like he bought his lab coat from a Halloween aisle is standing in their ER asking for wire transfers, then you need to start talking right now." He opened his mouth again, but I had already folded the paper and slid it into my blazer pocket, and that move alone told him I was not someone easily shaken. Then I turned to face my father, lying on the hospital bed, still clutching his chest like he was in the third act of a soap opera, and even his oxygen mask wasn't connected to anything. I looked at him for a long time, my lips pressed into a tight line before I let out a long, tired sigh and allowed my shoulders to slump in a way that looked like defeat. "It was not, it was bait." "Fine," I whispered loud enough for them to hear. "She wins. I cannot let him die because of some technical issue. I will pay the $80,000. And just like that, the transformation in the room was immediate. Tiffany stopped crying in an instant, her sobs switching off like someone had hit a light switch, her face lifting with something too close to a smirk. Beatrice, who had looked like she was about to faint, suddenly stood straighter, her eyes sharpening with renewed greed. Dante visibly relaxed, letting out a long breath, and the corners of his mouth curled up. "Thank God," he said, stepping aside like he was clearing the way for me to rush in and save the day again. "You are doing the right thing, Jordan. Dad always believed you would come through." I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with precision as I opened the banking app, and the screen unlocked with my Face ID, and I saw Dante lean slightly forward, his eyes glued to the screen, probably trying to see the balance as I tapped the buttons. "I am preparing the transfer now," I said deliberately, slowly, "but there is one condition," and I looked up slowly, making sure they all were watching me as I continued. "As a licensed forensic accountant and partner at my firm, my finances are under strict federal audit procedures. I cannot just move large amounts of money without a verifiable destination, so I will transfer the funds directly to the corporate account of St. Mary's Hospital, the one listed in the National Database and Public Registry. It will bypass this handwritten invoice completely and go straight to their billing department. That way it is tax deductible and legally traceable." And I looked back at Dr. Marcus, who was starting to sweat again, and I held my thumb over the button marked execute, but did not press it yet. And then everything happened fast. Dante suddenly lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with a strength I did not expect, and his voice cracked as he shouted no. His shout bounced off the sterile walls and drew attention from a nurse 2 cubicles down, but I stayed calm, looking down at his hand and then up into his wide, panicked eyes. "What do you mean, no?" I asked, my voice cool and steady. "I am paying for the surgery. Is that not what you wanted? The hospital system is down." He blurted. "Jordan, the wire transfer will not go through. It will just bounce and Dad will die." Waiting for it to clear, he was pointing at Beatrice now, practically begging. "You have to send it to Mom." He said, "Send it to her personal account. She will write a check to Dr. Marcus. It is faster." And I raised an eyebrow, trying not to smile. And what if I do not want to send it to a personal account? What if I want to pay the hospital directly? The silence that followed was full of tension. I let it stretch before I said, fine, if you insist I will send it to Beatrice's checking account, but I need to see her routing and account number. And Tiffany stepped in this time fast and smooth, as if she had been rehearsing it for weeks. We already wrote it down, she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a little card with neat handwriting, and she handed it to me, her fingers not trembling at all, and I took it. But before I entered anything into the app, I took a photo of the card and then slipped it into my bag and began to type in the numbers, my face neutral, but inside my mind racing, because now I had them, not just emotionally, but legally too. Dante stepped back, giving me space, while Tiffany and Beatrice stood quietly like predators waiting for the kill, and Dr. Marcus had vanished behind the curtain, probably realizing the scam was collapsing slowly and surely. I hovered over the transfer screen one last time and paused. Is there a memo I should include? I asked, just to see what they would say. Surgery payment, Tiffany said immediately, adding emergency funds for Dad. And I nodded, typed it in, and then pressed the final button. The screen swirled and loaded, and then confirmed for complete. Thank you for trusting us. Your payment has been processed. And I showed them the screen, and they all let out exaggerated sighs of relief, and Beatrice even put a hand on her chest like she was overwhelmed with gratitude. And then I turned and walked away, my heels echoing through the hallway of that fake hospital setup, not looking back, because I knew I had recorded every word and captured every lie, and most importantly followed the money, which in my world always leads to the truth. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me with one more sob story, but they had no idea I came prepared for war, and this was just the beginning of their end. She stared at me like she could not believe what I had just said, and then she blinked and her whole face changed as if someone had ripped off her mask, and I was finally seeing the greedy, hungry version of her that she tried to hide in public. And she grabbed the phone from my hand so fast it almost fell, and she gave it to Dante, who opened the banking app like he was handling a sacred relic, and I could see him checking the numbers as his mouth twitched like he had just tasted victory. And Beatrice finally moved from the wall where she had been pretending to look frail and faint, and she walked over to my father and said, I told you she would do it. I told you Jordan always comes through. And I watched the performance like I was watching actors in a bad movie that I had already seen before, and I was waiting for the part where the camera pulled back and revealed the whole set was fake. This time I was not going to change the channel. I was going to let it play until the last scene, and then I would roll the credits myself. And Dante held the screen up to me with the routing number already filled in, and I pretended to double-check it while I actually verified that it was not hospital account but a personal checking account linked to an address I had seen on one of the foreclosure notices. And Tiffany was standing behind him nodding like she was trying to hurry me along, and I could feel the pressure of all three of them pushing down on me like a wave of heat in a locked room. And I took a deep breath and said, fine, here goes nothing. And I pressed the confirm button and let the transaction process, and the moment it cleared I saw it on their faces, the change, the relaxation, the small smirks that they could not quite hide, as if a weight had been lifted, and now they could breathe again. And Dr. Marcus peeked his head back through the curtain and asked quietly, everything okay? And Dante said, yeah, Doc, thanks for your help, and gave him a thumbs up. And I swear the man actually winked at me like we were all in on the same joke, and I wanted to scream, but I smiled instead because the show was still going, and I was not ready to take my final bow. And I picked up my purse and said, I will be outside if anything changes, and turned around before they could thank me or offer one of their false blessings. And I walked out of that emergency room like I had just escaped from a burning house. And when I reached the parking lot, I finally let my shoulders fall and stared at the sky for a long time, trying to decide what kind of person I had become, and if this meant I was still their daughter or just the wallet with a pulse. And I got in the car and drove back to my condo in silence, the radio off, the city lights blurring past my window. And when I got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat in the dark watching the transaction confirmation still glowing on my screen. And I did not feel relief or pride. I felt nothing, just an empty space where something used And the next morning I got up and went to work like nothing had happened, because in my world work was the only thing that made sense, and at least spreadsheets did not lie, and numbers did not gaslight you into believing you owed them your life. And 2 days later I received a notification on my phone that the account I had transferred the money to had been closed, which was strange because no legitimate hospital account would vanish like that, and I ran a quick trace through the back end of my firm's compliance software and confirmed what I already knew: the funds had been rerouted twice, then withdrawn in full through a cashier's check, which meant the money was gone and untraceable. And still I waited, hoping maybe someone would call and say Dad had made it, or Tiffany would post something vaguely grateful online, or maybe Dante would send a single line of thanks, but nothing came, and 3 more days passed until I finally got a group text from the family chat I had muted months ago, and the message was from Beatrice, and it said, "Your father is recovering well. We are staying at the beach house to help him rest. Thank you for everything, Jordan." And there were 2 emojis, a heart and a praying hands, and I stared at the message like it was a billboard on fire, and I almost replied, but then I just locked my phone and walked away because there was nothing left to say. And the next week I got an invitation to my father's birthday party, a formal dinner at their country club with a note that said, "Family only, please, no plus ones," and it was like a slap in the face wrapped in silk, and I held it in my hand for a long time, wondering if I should go, if I should confront them, if I should burn the whole house down or walk away and never look back. And on the night of the party I showed up in a black dress with a clutch and my voice recorder tucked inside, just in case, because I was not there to celebrate, I was there to observe. And when I entered the room, the music stopped for a second as everyone turned to look at me, and I could see the panic in my mother's eyes and the forced smile on Dante's face, and Tiffany pretending she had not seen me at all. And I walked straight to the bar and ordered a club soda with lime, because I wanted a clear head for whatever came next. And I stood near the back wall, watching the speeches and the toasts and the laughter, all so hollow and polished and fake that it could have been a reality show. And when my father finally stood up to speak, his hands trembling just slightly, he looked right at me and said nothing, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. And then my mother stepped up to the mic and thanked everyone for coming, and said how proud she was of her family and how this gathering was for those who truly stood by them. And she turned her head slowly toward me and said, "Some people are not really family, no matter what the blood test says." And the room went silent, and a few people gasped and a few chuckled nervously, and my hand gripped the glass so tight I thought it might shatter. But I did not flinch. I stepped forward instead and said one sentence that made the entire room freeze, and made her eyes widen, and made Dante take a step back like I had pulled a weapon. And when I said it, I did not shout, I did not raise my voice. I just let the truth fall like a guillotine. And the only sound afterward was the ice melting in my untouched drink. They did not say a word after I spoke that one sentence, and it was like the air had been sucked out of the room, and even the clinking of glasses stopped, as if the party itself held its breath. And then she laughed. My mother actually laughed, and said with a voice too sweet to be real, "Well, I guess we all have different definitions of family, and some people just want attention." And I could see a few heads turn away, uncomfortable, unwilling to take sides, and my father looked down at his plate, pretending he had not heard anything, and Dante cleared his throat like he was about to speak, but I held up a hand and said, "Save it, I am not here to argue." And I walked out of that banquet hall without looking back, and got into my car, heart pounding and hands steady, because I had done what I needed to do, and now the silence was theirs to live with. And the next morning I got a message from Beatrice saying I had embarrassed the entire family and that I should apologize, and I responded with a single word, "No." And then I turned off my phone for 2 whole days and just existed, letting the anger bleed out of me slowly like a wound that had finally stopped, pretending it did not exist. And when I turned my phone back on, there were no missed calls from my father, and that told me more than any conversation ever could. And the next week went by in a blur of meetings and emails and the usual routine that kept me from spiraling, and I focused on my work, because my career was the only part of my life where truth mattered and results were real, and I did not have to guess at people's intentions, because if you performed well, you advanced. and if you did not, you fell behind, and that made sense to me more than any of their family dynamics ever did. And on Saturday morning, I got an unexpected call from an unknown number, and for a second, I thought it might be a scam, but something told me to answer, and when I did, it was a man with a quiet voice who said, "Hi, is this Jordan?" And when I said yes, he introduced himself as Mr. Sanchez, the estate attorney, handling my grandfather's will, and I was confused at first because I had not heard anything about him passing, and I asked when it happened, and he said about 3 weeks ago, and I asked why no one told me, and he paused before saying I was not on the contact list provided by the family, and something in my chest went cold and hard because that meant they had deliberately excluded me. And then he said, "But your grandfather left a letter addressed to you, and a specific instruction that we not distribute anything until you had been contacted." And I asked if I could come in, and he said yes, of course, and gave me the address and the time, and I was there the next morning in a gray pantsuit, sitting across from a man with thick glasses and a stack of papers, who handed me a single envelope with my name in familiar handwriting, and I opened it slowly, and inside was a note that said, "I always saw you, Jordan. I always knew what they did, and I am sorry I did not speak up more, and I hope what I left you helps you find peace." And underneath the note was a key, and Mr. Sanchez explained that my grandfather had left me his workshop and the surrounding property in his will, a small estate on the outskirts of town where he used to build furniture and fix things, and that no one else in the family was allowed to sell or alter it. And I felt something swell in my chest, not because of the inheritance, but because it meant he had known, he had believed me, and that meant everything. And I signed the documents and thanked the man and drove out to the property the same day, and the place looked exactly as I remembered it, the creaky gate, the gravel path, the smell of sawdust and old oil. And when I walked inside the workshop, it felt like stepping into a memory that had been waiting patiently, and I ran my hands along the bench he used to work at, and I cried for the first time in weeks, real tears, not of pain but of release. And then I started cleaning, organizing, fixing small things, because it felt like the right thing to do. And over the next few days, I turned the space into something more than just a monument. I made it functional again, and I started spending weekends there repairing old chairs, restoring cabinets, and slowly word got around, and people started asking if I could help with their furniture, and it became a quiet side business that brought me peace and purpose. And one afternoon, while sanding down an old headboard, I got a call from Tiffany, and I almost did not answer, but curiosity won, and I picked up, and she sounded different, tired maybe, or just shaken, and she asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed, and we met at a small cafe near the river, and she looked thinner than before her makeup lighter, and she did not waste time with small talk. She just said I did not know about the money. I swear I thought it was for the hospital. And I told her I knew that, and I believed her, and she looked relieved and then ashamed and said they are turning on each other now, Mom and Dante, and even Dad, and it is ugly. And I said I am not surprised, and she said I am sorry for everything. And I told her thank you, and she asked if we could stay in touch, and I nodded because I had no reason to shut her out anymore. And she had been the least cruel of them all. And after she left, I sat by the water for a long time, thinking about how strange it was that healing never came when you expected it, but always when you stopped waiting and started building something real. And the next time I visited the workshop, there was a letter on the door from a local historical society offering to partner with me to restore the building and turn it into a community space for artisans and veterans, and I smiled because my grandfather would have liked that, and I agreed, and the project began, and I poured myself into it heart and soul. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was not surviving, but actually living. And one evening, as the sun set behind the trees and the wind carried the scent of pine and varnish, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and thought about all the things I had lost and all the things I had found, and I realized they were not the same, and that was okay because I had something they could never take away: peace and truth, and a legacy built not on money or manipulation, but on real hands doing real work. And when the grand opening finally arrived and people came from all over to see the place and share their stories and bring pieces to repair, I felt my grandfather with me in every tool, every smile, every grain of wood, and I stood there proud and unshaken and whole. and when someone asked how I had gotten the idea to do all this, I simply said it started with a key, and that was enough. I was wiping sawdust from my hands when I heard the tires crunching gravel outside the workshop, and I stepped out expecting a delivery, but it was my father's car parked just off the side, and he stood by the hood looking uncertain as though he had not planned this far ahead, and I waited armed crossed heart steady, and he finally walked closer, stopping a few feet away, and said in a tired voice, "I heard what you are doing here, and it looks good," and I nodded, not offering anything more, and he looked around at the building, the porch, the windows, and said your grandfather would be proud, and I replied he always was, and that made him shift slightly, like my words had weight he was not prepared to carry, and he cleared his throat and said your mother is not doing well, and I asked what does that have to do with me, and he paused like he wanted to say something soft, something that might make this easier, but then gave up and just said she has been asking for you, and I looked him dead in the eye and asked before or after she called me a stranger at your party, and he winced and said that was not what she meant, and I said it is exactly what she meant, and I do not owe her anything, not visit, not forgiveness, not a single breath, and he dropped his gaze and nodded slightly and said I understand, and I said do you really, and he said no but I want to, and I told him wanting is not the same as doing, and then I turned and walked back inside without another word, and for a moment I thought he would follow, but he did not, and when I looked back he was already getting in the car and driving away, and I stood there watching the taillights fade and felt nothing, no guilt, no anger, no sadness, just clarity. And the next few days passed quietly as the workshop continued to grow, and more people came by with their broken furniture and their stories, and I listened and repaired and stayed grounded in the simplicity of things that could be fixed with patience and time. And then one morning I got a letter slipped under the door, and it was from the hospital, and it said that my mother had requested to see me, and she had written something and attached a note, and I opened the note, and it said, I know I failed you, I know you feel like I never protected you or saw you, and maybe I didn't, but I see you now, and I hope it is not too late, and I folded the letter and stared at it for a long time, not knowing what to feel, because for so long I had wanted her to say these things, and now that she had it felt like dust in my hands, too little too late, and yet still something, and I went back and forth all day debating whether to go, and finally I drove there, not for her but for myself, because I needed to see if there was anything left to say, and when I walked into the room she looked so small, not the towering presence I remembered, but a woman fading into her pillows, and her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she said Jordan, and I said hello, and she reached out a hand, and I hesitated before taking it, and she squeezed it like she was afraid I might disappear, and said I wanted to tell you face to face that I am sorry, and I said you already did in the letter, and she nodded and said I know, but I wanted to see your eyes, and I asked why now, and she said because I cannot pretend any more, and I asked what changed, and she said I got old and tired of lying, and I wanted at least one truth before I go, and I said you hurt me deeply, and I cannot pretend that an apology will erase it, and she nodded and said I do not expect it to, but I wanted you to know I was wrong, and that you deserved better. And for the first time in years I saw a tear roll down her cheek, and it did not make me feel powerful or victorious, it just made me feel tired, and I said thank you for saying it, and she closed her eyes for a long time, and then opened them, and said I always envied how strong you were, and I thought pushing you away would make you softer, more controllable, and I was wrong, and I said you were very wrong, and she said I know, and I have to live with that, and then she drifted off to sleep, still holding my hand, and I sat there for a while watching her breathe, and when I finally left I felt a strange weight lift, not because things were fixed, but because I had said what needed saying, and that was enough. And when I got back to the workshop there was a young woman waiting outside, and she introduced herself as Claire, a granddaughter of one of my grandfather's old war buddies, and she said she had heard about the restoration project and wanted to help, and she had a background in woodworking and preservation, and something in her energy reminded me of myself years ago, curious, driven, needing a purpose, and I said sure, come by tomorrow and we can get started, and she did, and she was good, really good, and we started working side by side, and the workshop began to evolve, not just in structure but in spirit, and it became more than just a place to fix things. It became a sanctuary for people looking to rebuild parts of themselves, and Claire told me one day while we were painting a shelf that her father had been harsh and controlling, and that she had run away when she was 17, and I told her I understood, and that not all wounds bleed, and she nodded like she felt seen, and I realized how much we all carried in silence, and how powerful it was to share the weight, and as months passed, the project grew and the community started donating old tools and books and materials, and we set up workshops for kids, and for veterans and people who had lost their way, and slowly the space transformed into something bigger than me, bigger than my grandfather even, and I knew he would be proud. And then one day I got a call from Dante, and I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer, and his voice was quiet, almost broken, and he said, "Mom passed this morning," and I said, "I am sorry," and he said, "She mentioned you last night. She said she was glad you came," and I said, "I know," and he asked if I would come to the service, and I paused and said, "I do not think I can," and he said, "I understand," and we were quiet for a long time before he said, "Thank you for seeing her," and I said, "I did it for myself," and he said, "Still thank you," and we hung up, and I stood there holding the phone thinking about how strange it was that loss could feel so familiar and so foreign at the same time, and I went to the workshop and ran my hand along the old wooden counter and whispered good bye, and that night I lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill and sat in silence thinking of all the words never said, and how sometimes peace did not come from closure, but from choosing your own ending. And the next day Claire came in with a box of old photos she had found in her attic, and we went through them laughing at the hairstyles and the clothes, and I found a picture of my grandfather younger than I had ever seen him, smiling next to a group of men in uniform, and on the back it said Brothers in Arms, and I framed it and hung it by the door, because that is what this place had become, a home for people trying to find their way back to themselves. And as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, I stood by the window watching the light fade and felt something settle inside me, something quiet and strong and unshakable, and I knew that whatever came next I was ready. Claire and I were working late that Friday evening, repairing the frame of an old oak bookshelf someone had brought in, and while she clamped the edges, I sanded the side panels in slow rhythmic movements that allowed my mind to wander back through the strange, peaceful silence that had filled my apartment since my mother passed, and even though I had not gone to the service and had not spoken to most of my family since that day at the hospital, I felt like something inside had clicked into place, like an old gear, finally aligned and moving again after being frozen for years, and the workshop had grown busier every week, with neighbors dropping by not just for repairs, but to share their stories or to volunteer, and even some high school kids from the nearby community center had started coming in on Saturdays, learning how to handle tools and build things with their hands, and the sense of purpose wrapped around the place like a warm old quilt, and Claire had become like a younger sister in many ways, bringing both laughter and a quiet strength to our days. And one afternoon, while sorting through a donation box filled with antique brass fixtures and loose nails, she paused and asked if I had ever thought about teaching full-time, and I laughed and said this was already more than enough, but the idea stayed with me long after she said it, and sometime around mid-October I found myself printing out flyers for a full workshop series, hoping to teach people the art of restoring forgotten things and breathing life into old wood and broken frames, and the first class filled faster than I expected, and soon we had 10 people crowding into the back room every Thursday evening, each of them hungry to learn and to share, and I watched them work with trembling hands and hopeful eyes, and I realized they were not just fixing furniture, they were mending their own fractured pieces. And one evening after class, I sat alone on the porch of the shop sipping tea and watching the stars blink awake in the velvet sky, and I thought about my grandfather and how he had built this space with his bare hands, how he had poured everything he had into it, not for money or recognition, but because he believed in the power of making things whole again, and I whispered thank you to him knowing he would hear it, and a few days later I received a package in the mail addressed in hand, writing I did not recognize, and inside was a photo album filled with old pictures from my childhood, holidays, birthdays, summers at the lake. Some I barely remembered, and some I had tried to forget, and tucked into the back was a note from my cousin Maya, who had not spoken to me since the party, and it simply said, I Found these cleaning out Auntie's place and I thought you should have them. I miss you and I hope we can talk sometime. And I closed the album and stared out the window as emotions rose and broke over me in quiet waves, and I thought about how much distance had grown between us, not just miles, but walls built out of years and silence. And that weekend, I texted her asking if she wanted to meet for coffee, and she replied yes almost immediately. And when we sat across from each other at a little cafe downtown, she looked older than I remembered, and maybe I did too, and she said, "I am sorry for what happened," and I said, "Me too," and we sat there sipping our drinks while the air around us softened and healed. And over the following weeks, more family reached out slowly, cautiously, like animals testing the wind, and I chose who to let in and who to leave behind without guilt or anger, just with quiet resolve. And in early November, I received a letter from the Community Development Office saying they wanted to feature our workshop in their local newsletter and asked if we would host an open house. And I said yes, and Claire and I spent days preparing, dusting, polishing, printing signs, arranging displays, and when the day came, the shop buzzed with laughter and music and fresh cider and people moving in and out, sharing memories and asking questions. And a little girl pointed at a rocking chair we had restored and said, "This looks like the one my grandma used to have," and her father smiled and said, "Maybe it is," and it felt like the entire town had wrapped itself around us like roots, digging deep and holding tight. And that night, Claire and I sat on the porch again, watching the last of the guests leave, and she turned to me and said, "You know, this place saved me," and I nodded because it had saved me too. And the next morning, I found a letter in the mailbox from the city council inviting me to apply for a grant to expand the space into a full restoration center. And I stared at it for a long time because it felt like a doorway opening into a future I had never imagined, and I called Dante later that week, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to, and when he answered, he sounded surprised and said, "Hey," and I said, "Hey," back, and we talked for almost an hour about small things and big things, and finally I told him about the grant, and he said, "That is amazing, you deserve it," and I said, "Thank you," and he asked if he could visit sometime, and I said maybe, and it felt honest and enough. And when I hung up, I felt no pressure, no ache, just calm. And as winter crept closer, the workshop became even more of a refuge, filled with the smell of cedar and paint, and the steady rhythm of hammers and saws, and I found myself smiling more, sleeping better, breathing deeper. And Claire suggested we start a memory wall where visitors could pin photos or notes about things they had lost or repaired. And soon the back corner of the shop blossomed into a collage of grief and joy and hope. And one day, an old man pinned up a picture of a woman in a wedding dress and said she passed before I could fix our chair, but you did it for her, and I hugged him and thanked him. And that night I sat by the firelight writing in my journal, and I realized how far I had come from the girl who stood outside that birthday party trembling with rage and grief, and now I was building something with my own hands, something lasting. And I wrote the words, "I choose peace," and closed the book and leaned back in my chair as the snow began to fall quiet and soft against the window. Winter deepened around us, and the workshop turned into a sanctuary of warmth and quiet industry, as outside the streets were blanketed in white, and the cold pushed people indoors. But inside the shop, the scent of cedar and varnish drifted in the air, and the space buzzed with a peaceful rhythm of creation and healing. And we set up small heaters and gave out warm cider to those who stayed late, and it became more than just a place to fix furniture. It became a second home to many, including me and Claire, and we often found ourselves staying after hours, just talking or working on personal projects. And one night she brought in a wooden toy her grandfather had carved decades ago. Its limbs cracked and its paint faded, and we spent hours carefully restoring it until it looked new again. And when she held it up to the light, there were tears in her eyes, and she whispered he would have loved this. And I knew she was not just talking about the toy, and it was moments like that that made me feel like I was doing something while something that mattered. And then one afternoon, as I was teaching a couple how to repair the leg of an antique stool, a woman walked in wearing a coat looked familiar, and when she pulled back her hood I realized it was my Aunt Valerie, and for a moment I froze, unsure how to react, because she had been one of the loudest voices against me at the hospital and at the party, and her words had cut deep. But she just stood there quietly until I approached and asked if I could help her, and she said I came to ask if you would consider repairing this, and she held up a faded photo frame, its glass cracked and its edges chipped, and she said it was the only picture I have of your mother and me when we were children, and I stared at it unsure what to say, and finally I took it from her hands and nodded, and said it will be ready in 3 days, and she looked like she wanted to say more, but instead she thanked me and left, and over the next few days I worked on that frame with unusual care, sanding and staining and replacing the glass, and when she returned and saw it, her eyes filled, and she said she would understand if I never wanted to speak to her again, but she was sorry for everything she had said and done, and that grief had made her cruel, and I listened in silence, and then said I accept your apology, but I am not the same person I was before. She nodded and said I can see that, and walked out with the frame pressed tightly to her chest, and after that I started receiving more visitors from my past, trickling in with awkward smiles and quiet voices, each of them holding something broken and asking if I could fix it, and I always said yes, because I knew they were not just talking about the items they brought. And one day as I was locking up, I noticed a man standing across the street watching the shop, and when I stepped outside I realized it was Dante, and he walked over slowly like he was not sure if he should be there, and said I was just in the neighborhood, and I figured I would check out the place, and I said you want the tour, and he laughed and nodded, and I showed him the shop, and he walked around quietly touching things and looking at the memory wall. And finally he said this is really something, and I said thanks, and we stood there in silence until he asked, do you ever think about coming back home? And I said this is my home now, and he nodded and said I figured, and he turned to leave, and I called out Dante, and he turned, and I said thank you for what you said that day in the hospital, and he smiled and said I meant it, walked away, and I stood there watching him go and felt nothing but peace. And that weekend Claire and I hosted a holiday workshop for kids, and the place was filled with laughter and music and sticky fingers covered in glue and glitter, and we built small toy trains and snowflake ornaments, and parents stayed to help, and by the end everyone was hugging and taking pictures, and one boy came up to me with a crooked little wooden star and said this is for you because you helped my mom fix her smile, and I knelt down and asked what he meant, and he said she was always sad, but now she smiles when she comes here, and I hugged him tightly and said thank you, and I hung the star above the counter. And every time I looked at it, I remembered that moment, and on Christmas morning, I opened the shop just for a few hours because I knew some people would have nowhere else to go, and Claire brought in cookies, and we made tea, and we sat with old Mr. Harris, who had lost his wife last year, and with Janine, who was spending her first holiday alone since her divorce, and it was quiet and beautiful. And afterward I went home and lit a candle for my grandfather and my mother, and I sat in silence feeling their presence around me like a blanket, and I whispered I am doing okay, and I hope you are proud, and I could almost hear them say we are. And as the year came to a close, I found myself planning for the future, thinking about applying for the grant, and maybe even turning the shop into a nonprofit. Maybe traveling to other towns to teach others how to start places like this, and I knew I was dreaming big. But for the first time in a long time, it did not scare me, and one night Claire and I sat on the porch watching snow fall, and she said, do you think you will ever forgive her completely? And I said I already have, and she asked really, and I said yes, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting or going back. It means letting go of the weight and choosing not to carry it anymore. And she nodded and said that is a good way to put it, and we sat there in silence watching the snow, and I felt light as air. And that night I wrote in my journal, I am no longer angry, I am no longer broken, I am just me, and that is enough. And I closed the book and went to sleep with a smile. Spring arrived quietly, and with it came the kind of warmth that softened even the hardest edges of winter, and I found myself sweeping open the doors to the workshop and letting the sunlight in while the scent of sawdust mixed with blooming jasmine from the alley, and it was the season of beginning, which made what arrived in the mail feel even more surreal, because one morning as I was sorting through bills and flyers, I found a pale envelope with the university's logo embossed on the top, and when I opened it, I realized it was the grant application letter I had submitted on a whim weeks ago. With Claire's encouragement, and my hands trembled as I read the words, we are pleased to inform you that your community restoration initiative has been selected for the final round, and I just stood there holding the letter against my chest as the tears welled up in my eyes because I had not thought it would matter, and yet here it was a chance to grow something that had saved me and now might save others, and Claire was the first person I told, and she screamed so loud the paintbrush fell from her hand and splattered on the wall, and we danced in the middle of the shop like children with no music and no care, and over the next few weeks we prepared presentation boards, we collected before and after photos, we made lists of testimonials and statistics. And one night, Claire even helped me film a short video where I explained what the workshop had become and how it helped people heal, not just fix things, and we submitted it all just days before the deadline, and then we waited, and each day felt like it stretched twice as long as the one before. But in the meantime, we did not stop the work. We kept teaching, we kept repairing, we kept opening the door to anyone who needed to sit and breathe and make something. And one afternoon, an older woman named Mrs. Gardner came in with a chair that had belonged to her daughter, and she said it had been broken in a fight years ago, and no one had touched it since, but she wanted it whole again. And we spent 3 days working side by side, quietly sanding, gluing and painting, and on the third day when we finished she sat in it and whispered, "Now I feel like I can forgive," and she left smiling, and I thought maybe that was the kind of miracle this place was built for. And then one cloudy Thursday in mid-May I received the final letter from the university, and I could not open it right away, so I placed it on the counter and stared at it while the clock ticked. And finally Claire walked over and said, "If you do not open that in the next 5 seconds, I will do it myself." And I laughed and tore the envelope open. And when I saw the words, "We are honored to award you the Community Development Grant of $25,000, I nearly fell to the floor. And we both cried and hugged and screamed, and customers came in and joined us, and it was wild and beautiful. And we used part of the money to expand the shop, to buy more tools, to host more classes, fix up the back patio, and turn it into a garden seating area. And that summer we held our first community dinner under string lights and candles and long tables filled with potluck dishes, and it was more than I had imagined. And that night I gave a short speech I had not prepared where I thanked everyone for believing in the shop and for helping me believe in myself, and I looked out at their faces, some familiar, some new, and I realized I had created something that had roots and branches, and it was still growing. And then as I was putting away chairs, I saw a small envelope left on the table, addressed to me in neat cursive, and when I opened it, I saw a letter from my half-sister Ashley, and she wrote, "I know, I was not kind, I know. I was jealous, I did not understand why you were loved so easily, and I hated you for it. And then I watched you walk away with nothing, and turn it into something. And I understand now, and if you ever want to meet, I would like to talk." And my hands shook reading it, because Ashley had been the one who clapped when my mother said those awful words at the party, and I had not spoken to her since, but something in her words felt honest and raw, and I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer and spent the next week thinking and talking to Claire. And finally I replied and said, "I will meet you once, and only to talk." And we met in a quiet cafe near the train station, and she looked different, older but softer, and she did not wear the smug expression I remembered. And she said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet," and I nodded. And she said I was wrong about everything, and I said, "I know." And she said, "I do not expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say it to your face." And I said, "Thank you," and we sat in silence for a while drinking tea. And then she asked about the shop, and I told her, and she listened. And when we parted, she did not ask to meet again, and I did not offer, but it felt like closure, like a door I could finally shut without anger. And the next few months were filled with joy and hard work and milestones, and on the 1-year anniversary of the workshop opening we held a celebration, and even the mayor showed up and gave a short speech about community resilience and small miracles. And someone had brought a cake that said, "To broken things made whole," and I took a picture and framed it and hung it on the wall beside the first tool I had ever bought. And as summer faded into autumn, I began to get invitations to speak at events and schools, and even a local television segment asked to do a feature. And every time I stood in front of a crowd, I felt the nerves shake my bones, but then I remembered what I had come through, and I told myself story with honesty, and people listened, and afterward they came up with tears and thank yous and stories of their own. And I realized my voice mattered not because it was loud, but because it was real, and I wrote all of it in a journal, one page every night, and it became a book of gratitude and growth. And when October rolled around, Claire and I started planning a Halloween charity drive with costumes and crafts and treats for the kids, and one night after closing, she stayed behind and said, "I have something to tell you," and I braced myself, but she smiled and said I got accepted into the creative arts therapy program and I leave in January, and I hugged her and said that is amazing, and she said I would not have applied if I had not met you, and I felt both joy and sadness, and we promised to stay in touch and make the most of the next few months, and she became even more radiant after that. As if the path ahead had lit up, and the night she left we threw a little goodbye party, and I gave her a carved wooden box with her name on it, and she gave me a sketch of the shop in pencil and charcoal, and it hangs beside my desk even now, and the winter that followed was quieter but full of light, and visitors and hope, and I kept going because I knew I was no longer alone and no longer lost, and every broken chair and fractured frame felt like a reminder that things can be made whole again if we care enough to try. After Claire left for her new journey, the shop felt quieter, and even though the days were still filled with people and repairs, and the sounds of sanding and laughter, something about her absence left a gap in the rhythm like a favorite song missing its chorus, and I tried to keep the energy high. The others who had come to depend on this place, but when I locked up at night, the silence felt heavier than before, and the winter crept in slowly, not just in the air, but in my bones, and I found myself spending longer hours at the shop, tinkering with broken toasters, old cabinets, and even radiators just to stay busy. And one evening, I sat down with a cup of tea and my mother's journal, which I had only skimmed before, but now I opened it to the first page and let myself really read it, and her handwriting curved across the yellowed pages in soft ink, and the first line stopped me cold. I am afraid that by the time Jordan reads this I will not be here, and as I kept reading, I realized she had written it over years, from when I was just a child to her final months, and she had poured herself into those pages, her guilt, her longing, her explanations, and I sat there stunned as I read entries where she apologized for failing me, for letting fear dictate her choices, and for letting bitterness shape her parenting. And there were moments where she celebrated my wins from afar, quietly, like when she wrote about watching me dance at school, or hearing that I made the honor roll, and she wrote I wanted to hug her and tell her she made me proud, but I never knew how, and by the time I reached the last page, my heart ached in a way I had not expected, because even though she had hurt me deeply, she had also loved me, even if she never figured out how to show it right. And I closed the journal and held it against my chest, and for the first time in years I let the memory of her come without anger, just sorrow, and maybe a touch of grace. And the next morning I brought the journal to the shop and placed it on the shelf next to the community photo wall where Claire's sketch and potluck pictures hung, and slowly over the next weeks I found myself speaking about my mother differently, not with spite, but with an odd honesty that surprised even me, and people listened and shared their own stories about complicated parents and forgiveness and pain. And one man told me about how he had not spoken to his dad in 20 years, and now wished he had, because he recently passed and left nothing but questions, and I told him I understood, and it became clear that the shop was not just a place for repairs, it was becoming a place for healing. And one snowy afternoon in February, a girl no older than 16 came in with a broken lamp and said quietly that her foster mom told her to throw it away, but she wanted to fix it because it reminded her of her real mom. And we sat together with glue and wire and patience, and when the light finally flickered on her eyes lit up, and she whispered, "Thank you," and it felt like something sacred had passed between us. And that night, I stayed late again, journaling and thinking, and I wrote down a sentence from my mother's pages: "Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is remembering and choosing peace," and I taped it to the wall above the coat rack, and people started noticing it and asking about it, and then writing their own lines of healing on little scraps of paper and taping them next to it, and soon that wall was covered in wisdom from strangers and survivors and hearts trying to heal. And during all of this I kept receiving letters from the university and the grant sponsors checking on our progress and planning a visit, and that pushed me to polish up the back patio even more and create a photo book of the year's events with captions and little notes from the kids and seniors and volunteers. And in the spring, I got a call from a woman named Renata who ran a podcast about community building, and she said someone had told her about the shop and she wanted to come see it and do a live interview, and I agreed nervously, and when she arrived she was kind and curious and asked thoughtful questions, and the episode aired 2 weeks later. And suddenly more people started coming, not just from the neighborhood, but from the next city over, and donations increased, and one woman drove 2 hours just to bring her mother's sewing machine for repair, and said I listened to you and I needed to see it for myself, and that kind of support began to shift something in me, not just gratitude, but a sense of purpose that ran deeper than I could explain. And in April, I received a surprise letter from the local high school asking if I would give a speech at their Community Day event, and I almost said no, but something nudged me to go, and I stood in front of 100 students and told my story from the party to the eviction to the workshop, and I told them that sometimes you will not get the love you deserve from the people who are supposed to give it to you, but that does not mean you are not worthy, and afterward a boy came up and hugged me and said thank you for saying that, and I carried that moment with me through the next few months, and in May, just before Mother's Day, I found myself standing at my mother's grave with fresh flowers and her journal in my bag, and I read one page aloud, the one where she said I wanted to be better, but I did not know how, and I whispered, I believe you and I forgive you, and I left the flowers and walked away lighter than I had arrived, and back at the shop we prepared for summer by launching our new mentor program, pairing volunteers with local teens, and teaching not just repairs but patience, communication and trust, and it blossomed beautifully, and one boy named Ethan, who barely spoke when he arrived, started leading classes by July, and when his mom came to visit, she cried and said, I do not know what you did, but thank you, and I said we just gave him space to be who he already was. That became our quiet motto, and by the time autumn leaves began to fall again, I found myself writing my own entries, not just in the shop log, but in a separate notebook titled Things I Have Learned, and it was filled with lessons from pain, from love, from resilience, and from the people who walked through our doors every day. And one evening, I opened an email from a publisher who had heard about the shop from the podcast, and she asked if I had ever considered turning my story into a book, and I froze for a second, then smiled, because maybe, just maybe, this whole journey had more chapters still waiting to be written. After I read that email from the publisher, I sat with the idea for a while, unsure if I was ready to tell the whole story, not just the good parts or the healing, but the broken, messy, heartbreaking truth of everything that happened, and the thought of putting it all down again in a way the world could see made my hands tremble a little, but also made something in me feel alive, like maybe this was the next chapter, like maybe this was the reason for everything. And for the next few days I went about my routine with the idea hovering behind every repair, every conversation, every evening cup of tea. And then one night I sat down at the shop after hours. The only sound was the gentle hum of the radiator, and I pulled out an old notebook, the one Claire had given me years ago, with a quote on the front that said, "Your story is your power." And I started writing, not like journaling, not like planning, just writing, telling everything like I was sitting across from someone who deserved the truth, and the pages started filling up quickly, the words tumbling out like they had been waiting all this time. And it was harder than I thought, not because I had to relive the pain, but because I had to be honest about myself too, about the ways I stayed quiet, the times I doubted myself, the moments when I wanted to give up. And as winter slowly began to loosen its grip, the shop came alive again with new energy. We got a group of college students who wanted to volunteer for spring break, and they brought this fresh burst of laughter and chaos, and we started a weekend class for beginners in carpentry and electronics. And one of the students, Devin, had lost his father the year before, and said this place made him feel like he was building something with him again. And I watched him sanding the edge of a shelf with this focus and care that was almost meditative, and I thought about how many pieces of grief were being held in this little building every day, and how maybe healing was not just about talking, it was also about doing, about making and fixing and sharing the quiet space where hands could speak what mouths could not. And one Saturday afternoon, a man I had never seen before walked in with a broken watch. He looked to be in his late 60s, his clothes neat but worn, and he placed the watch on the counter and said it stopped ticking the day she left, and I nodded gently and invited him to sit. And he watched closely as I opened the back, cleaned out, the dust replaced the tiny cracked gear, and when it started ticking again, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." And when he left, he said, "I did not know I needed this," and that stayed with me for days, and I wrote about him in the notebook. Too, not with his name, just with the feeling he brought, and the reminder that people carry stories in objects, in grief, in silence, and it made me think more about what the book could become, not just my voice, but maybe something layered like the shop, a space where many voices could echo, and I started collecting small stories from our guests with their permission. And I titled that section "The People Who Passed Through," and slowly it began to take shape, and one afternoon I got an email from the publisher, again saying they were heading into their spring review cycle, and asked if I was ready to submit, and I stared at the screen for a while, then replied yes and hit send and sat back and closed my eyes and let the fear and relief wash over me. And I told Claire that night on the phone, and she squealed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear, and she said, "I knew you would do it. I am proud of you," and those words settled in a place in my heart that still needed them. And she said she might be able to visit in the summer between semesters, and I told her the guest room was waiting. And after we hung up, I sat on the front step, watching the light fade and feeling more whole than I had in years. And a week later, a package arrived from the publisher with a few books they thought might inspire me, stories of community and resilience and women building from nothing, and I devoured them over the next week, scribbling notes in the margins, sticky tabs everywhere, and I realized something. I wanted this book not to be about blame or revenge or even just healing. I wanted it to be a map, a way through the mess that might help someone else find their footing when everything falls apart, and that meant telling it all, not just the milestones, but the nights I cried on the kitchen floor, days I could not get out of bed, the anger that flared up out of nowhere, and the soft, quiet moments where grace slipped in and softened everything. And in early May, the publisher called me and said they wanted to move forward officially and start working with me on a manuscript. And I sat down right there in the middle of the shop floor and cried, and I told them yes, of course, yes. And the next day I cleared a corner of the office and turned it into a writing space, a little desk, a lamp, my notebook, and a stack of drafts. And each morning before the shop opened, I wrote for an hour, and it became a rhythm, and it helped that the shop was buzzing with projects again. The mentor program had grown. We were now paired with 2 schools and a retirement home, and it was beautiful to watch the exchange of skill and patience and stories between generations. And we hosted a summer kickoff party in June with music and a picnic, and even a little performance by some of the kids, and people danced and laughed. And I stood there looking around thinking this was the dream I never dared to speak aloud. And Claire arrived a few weeks later, sun-kissed and wide-eyed, and hugged me like we had never been apart, and she stayed for 2 weeks, helping around the shop, telling stories from her classes. And one evening, we sat on the roof with mugs of tea and watched the stars, and she said, "You are really doing it." And I said, "I guess so." And she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I hope Mom can see you." And I said, "I think she can," and for the first time that thought felt comforting, not sad. And when Claire left, I got back to the manuscript, determined to finish the first draft by end of summer, and every chapter poured out like it had been waiting. And the more I wrote, the more I understood myself, and the more I forgave myself too. And one Sunday morning, I printed the whole thing and laid it out on the table, pages everywhere, and I sat with it in silence, reading it all the way through. And when I got to the end, I cried again, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, and it was mine, and I sent it to the publisher that night and slept like I had not slept in years. And in August they replied with notes and a timeline, and the word excited in bold, and I printed their email and pinned it to the wall of the office. And it was around that time that we got a letter from the city saying they wanted to recognize the shop for its impact, and invite me to speak at the Community Leadership Forum, and I was stunned and nervous and honored. And when the day came, I stood on that stage and looked out at the crowd and told them the truth, that sometimes healing starts in the wreckage, that sometimes family is found not given, and that sometimes one broken toaster at a time you rebuild yourself. And afterward people lined up to thank me, to share their own stories, and to ask how they could help, and I told them, come by, see the place, join us, and many did. And by the time fall arrived, I was back in edits with the publisher, finalizing details and choosing a title, and they asked me what I wanted to call it, and I said I think it should be called The Repair Shop, and they loved it, and I smiled because it was simple and true, and that was enough. When the cover design came in from the publisher, I held the image in my hands for a long moment, the soft blue and amber tones blending with the gentle outline of tools and shelves, and a small wooden heart carved in the corner, barely visible, but it was there, and it made my chest tighten in the best way. And I took a picture and sent it to Claire, and she called right away, and we both screamed for a second, and then she said, it is perfect, it looks like hope, and we laughed and cried a little, and I told her I would send her the first printed copy, the second would go to the shop, and the third I would keep for myself, not to hold on to, but to remember what came from all that pain and silence. And then the advanced reader copies were printed and mailed, and the shop felt electric again, like a storm waiting to break, but in a good way, and people who had visited before started emailing saying they could not wait to read it, and they were proud, and that they remembered our conversations, and it reminded me that every person who came through here left something behind and took something too. And when the book finally launched, it was surreal, not like a movie premiere or anything, just quiet, steady waves of support, comments, messages, people stopping by and saying, I read your story and I see myself in it. And one woman who looked about 70 hugged me so tightly in the middle of aisle 3 and said I thought I was the only one, and that is when I knew the book had done what I needed it to do, not sell, not impress, not fix anything, but connect. And that weekend the shop hosted a small celebration with fairy lights and cookies and music played softly from the old speaker, and we gathered in a circle and took turns sharing moments we had repaired something, and not just objects, relationships, hopes, pieces of ourselves, and someone brought a broken necklace, and we repaired it together. Someone else told a story about how their son came back after 3 years away, and they found their way back to each other over a project rebuilding an old motorcycle, and in that moment, surrounded by all these stories and faces, I realized the shop had become more than just a place. It was a living thing. It held us like a steady hand. And then one afternoon a woman walked in who looked vaguely familiar, and when she introduced herself, I almost dropped the cup in my hand, because it was Diane, one of my mom's closest friends, someone I had not seen since the funeral, and she looked older, softer, and she said she had heard about the book and wanted to see the place, and I showed her around, and she kept nodding, slowly touching the edges of things, and finally she said, your mom would have been proud, and I looked away because the words hit something raw, and I said maybe, and she said no, really, she just did not know how to show it, and I said I used to think that was an excuse, and she said maybe it was, but it was also true, and then she left, and I sat down in the office feeling a strange mix of peace and confusion, and something like forgiveness trying to make its way through. And later that evening, I found the bracelet my mom used to wear in a box of old things I had packed away years ago, and I held it, and for the first time I did not feel anger, just a quiet sadness for all that was missed and a soft hope for what could still grow. And in the months that followed, the shop continued to evolve. We launched a scholarship program for young builders and creators thanks to a local sponsor who read the book and wanted to help, and I got invited to speak at 2 schools and a community center, and each time I stood there telling the same story, I felt less afraid, less like I was reopening wounds, and more like I was offering something useful. And one evening, just before fall settled in, I got an email from a reader who said the book made her call her sister after 20 years, and now they were planning to visit the shop together, and I stared at the screen and whispered thank you out loud, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe. And I thought back to the moment in my dad's backyard, the sting of those words, you are not even family, and how they had cracked something in me. That day, and now years later, standing in the heart of a space built from that break, I could finally say I am not just family, I am home. And Claire came to visit again, this time with her boyfriend, and they brought a gift, a framed photo of the two of us from when we were kids sitting in a blanket fort, surrounded by books and flashlights, and she said, "I want you to remember you were always strong, even when it did not feel like it." And I hugged her tighter than ever, and after they left, I hung the photo in the shop right near the register, so it would always be seen, and people often asked about it. I would smile and say that is where it all began, and one afternoon a man came in holding a photo of a bike from 1972 and asked if we could help restore it, and I said we could try, and over the next 6 weeks he came every Saturday and we worked on it together, and he told me about his daughter, how they used to ride together and how she passed 5 years ago. And when we finally got the engine running again, he sat down and cried, and I sat with him and said nothing because nothing was needed, and he said thank you for letting me feel close to her again, and those moments kept coming. Reminders that healing does not always look like joy, sometimes it looks like tears and silence and breathing and staying. And I kept writing, not another book yet, just thoughts, observations, tiny stories that I collected like fireflies in a jar, glowing softly, reminding me of the light. And one morning I opened the shop and found a note slipped under the door. No name, no sender, just 4 words, "Your mom sees you," and I stood there holding it, my heart thudding in my chest. And I never found out who wrote it, but I kept it taped inside my notebook, and sometimes when I feel doubt creeping in, I read it again and remember that maybe love comes back in strange ways, maybe it never really leaves. And on the anniversary of the shop's opening, we threw a celebration bigger than before with games and a raffle and music, and I gave a little speech not because I had to, but because I wanted to, and I looked out at the crowd, at the volunteers, the regulars, the new faces, the children chasing each other between tables, and I said this shop was built from a broken heart and some broken things, and every single one of you helped turn it into a home, and people clapped, and someone shouted, "We love you," and I laughed and said, "I love you too," and I meant it. And that night, after everyone left and the lights were off, I stood in the quiet space and whispered thank you, not just to the people, not just to the shop, but to the version of myself who kept going, who dared to build, who chose love over bitterness. And I walked home under a sky full of stars, feeling whole and ready for whatever came next. After the anniversary celebration, I began to realize how much had changed, not just in the shop, but in me, and every quiet moment reminded me that I had built something that mattered, something that lasted longer than anger and louder than silence. And the emails kept coming, and some made me laugh, others made me cry, and a few made me sit in stunned silence, because they spoke of healing and loss and trying again. And I started replying late at night, after the shop closed, with the old lamp buzzing softly, and sometimes I would stop mid-reply and just breathe, soaking it all in. And then one afternoon I was asked to speak at a regional event, a gathering of small business owners and community builders, and I almost said no because I still carried pieces of doubt in my pocket. But Claire said you have to, and my dad nodded and said, "Tell them what you told me." And so I went and stood in a room full of people with stories etched into their hands and faces, and I told them about a broken bracelet and a birthday party and a sentence that nearly unraveled me, and I told them about wood glue and stubborn hope, and how every person who walked into the shop gave me a piece of myself back. When I was done, no one clapped right away, they just sat quietly, and then one woman stood up and said thank you, and then others followed, and someone said, "I think I need to go fix something," and I smiled because that was it, that was the whole point, and I left that evening feeling like something had shifted again, like I had just stepped onto a path I never planned for, but now could not stop walking. And a few days later, I got a call from a local university. Someone had shared my story with them, and they wanted to create a small documentary, a short film about the shop and the journey, and again I hesitated, but then I remembered how powerful it was to be seen, and so I said yes. And over the next few weeks, a crew came in with cameras and microphones and questions, and I answered honestly and fully, not hiding the cracks, because those were part of the story too. And they interviewed customers and volunteers and even my dad, and when it was finished, we hosted a screening right in the shop with the projector set up on the back wall. and chairs borrowed from the community center, and people packed in shoulder to shoulder. And when the film ended, no one moved for a second, and then someone whispered, "That was real," and I knew we had done it again, built something meaningful together. And that night my dad came up to me and handed me an envelope, and inside was a letter in his handwriting. And I read it later alone in the office, and it said I was wrong about a lot, but never about you, and I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where I kept the old photos and tiny tools and a list of names from our first ever volunteer sign up. And later that month Claire surprised me with a visit, and we sat on the floor of the shop with coffee and snacks, and she asked if I remembered the time we tried to fix a broken toaster when we were kids, and I laughed and said we made it worse, and she said yes, but we tried, and that counts. And we spent the whole day fixing little things and talking about big ones. And she told me her mom was asking about me, and that she had read the book, and I blinked and asked what she thought, and Claire smiled and said she cried and said I should have done better. And I said it is okay, and I meant it may be not all the way, but enough. And as fall turned to winter, the shop took on a new rhythm. Slower, softer people still came in, still shared, still mended, but everything felt steadier, like we had found our beat. And I started writing again, not for a book this time, but just to keep the stories alive. And one morning I got a call from someone who introduced herself as a producer for a podcast, and she said she wanted to feature me and the shop. And again I hesitated because I was still getting used to my voice being heard, but she was kind and patient and asked thoughtful questions. And we recorded the interview in the office, and I told her everything, the truth, not the polished version. And when it aired, we got messages from all over, people saying they felt braver just hearing it. And I pinned a map on the wall and started marking where each message came from. And soon the wall was full of tiny pins, like a constellation built from connection. And my dad helped hang a small sign above it that said "Where Healing Travels," and I stood back and felt proud. And then one night I got an email from someone with a familiar name, and my stomach flipped because it was my mom's sister, and I had not heard from her in years. And she said she had read the book and watched the documentary and listened to the podcast, and that she wanted to visit. And I did not know what to say, so I waited and thought and talked to Claire and my dad. And finally I replied and said okay. And when she arrived a week later, we hugged awkwardly, and then just sat in the shop sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. And she said your mom always wanted to come back to that shop, but she did not know how. And I said I wish she had, and she nodded and said me too. And before she left, she bought a tiny heart keychain from the display and said, I want to carry this with me to remember that repair is possible. And I stood there watching her go and felt something settle in my chest, like the final piece of a long puzzle sliding into place. And I realized that forgiveness does not always need an apology. Sometimes it just needs space and time, and the willingness to keep the door open. And in the quiet that followed, I kept working, kept showing up, kept mending both objects and people and myself. And one morning a boy around 10 years old came in holding a broken clock, and he said it used to be his grandpa's and he wanted to fix it for his dad. And I said let us try, and we worked on it for hours, and when it finally ticked again, he grinned so wide it lit up the whole room. And I thought, this is what we are here for. And I wrote his name on a little card and added it to the memory wall, now filled with dozens of names and dates and short notes. And that wall had become a kind of heartbeat for the shop. Each card a reminder that every repair carried a story, and every story carried someone forward. And as the year came to a close, I sat in the office looking at all we had built, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, complete, not perfect, not finished, but whole. And that night, as snow began to fall, I stood at the front window watching it cover the street, and I whispered thank you again, not because everything was easy now, but because everything was honest, and I knew that was enough. And I locked the door, turned off the lights, and walked home feeling like maybe, just maybe, the best was still to come. The weeks after everything finally collapsed were strangely quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, because for the first time in my life, no one from my family was calling, demanding, explaining, manipulating, or pretending. And the silence felt heavy at first, but slowly it began to feel like peace. And I returned fully to my work, diving deeper into cases that required absolute focus, because numbers never lied and spreadsheets never played favorites, and every fraud I exposed felt like a reminder that truth always leaves a trail. And while my family scrambled to understand how their world had fallen apart, I stayed still, watching from a distance, not out of revenge, but because I had already given enough, and I knew that stepping back was the only way to stay whole. And within weeks the truth began surfacing naturally, just like I knew it would, because when money dries up, masks fall, and creditors called and banks asked questions, and the illusion my parents and brother had lived inside for years began cracking from every side. And I received messages from extended family members, some angry, some confused, some suddenly polite, and I ignored them all because I had learned that explanations are a privilege, not a requirement. And then one afternoon, a detective contacted me regarding financial irregularities tied to my brother and the so-called business ventures he claimed were producing income, and I answered honestly, providing documentation when legally required and nothing more, because I did not need to exaggerate or accuse. The numbers did that for me. And soon after that my father attempted to reach me through a work email address, apologizing vaguely, blaming stress and misunderstanding and family pride. And I read it once calmly and deleted it, because apologies that arrive only after consequences are not apologies, they are survival tactics. And as winter passed into spring, my life moved forward cleanly, efficiently, and without chaos, and I traveled more, worked more, and slept better than I had in years. And people at work noticed a change. They said I seemed lighter, sharper, more confident, and they were right, because I was no longer carrying the weight of being invisible and unwanted. And one evening, while reviewing an audit report, I realized something simple but powerful. I had never failed them, they had failed me, and understanding that fully changed everything. And months later, I attended an industry conference where I was asked to speak about forensic accountability and ethical finance, and as I stood on stage explaining how hidden patterns always surface, I thought about my own life, and how the biggest fraud I had ever uncovered was the lie that love had to be earned through sacrifice and silence. And after the conference I returned home to my quiet apartment, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window watching the city lights, feeling grounded and complete. And then one day a letter arrived, handwritten and careful, and it was from my father. And this time the words were different. There was no demand, no guilt, no assumption, just regret and acknowledgement. And he wrote that he finally understood how much I had given and how little they had offered in return, and that losing me was the greatest failure of his life. And I sat with that letter for a long time, feeling sadness but not obligation, and I placed it in a drawer, not to respond to, but to close that chapter properly. And I continued building my life, intentionally choosing relationships that felt mutual, choosing peace over performance and honesty over approval. And occasionally someone would ask about my family, and I would simply say we are not close, and that would be enough, because my story no longer needed defending. And as years passed, I built a reputation, not just as an expert, but as someone unshakable and reliable, and I mentored young professionals who reminded me of who I used to be: hungry, capable, and overlooked. And I told them to trust their work and never shrink for anyone. And sometimes late at night, I would think back to that party, the laughter, the words that cut, and the moment everything changed, and I no longer felt anger, only gratitude, because that moment freed me and gave me the clarity I needed to finally choose myself. And one afternoon, while walking through the city, I passed a family laughing loudly on a restaurant patio, and instead of envy, I felt relief, because I had learned that family is not defined by blood, but by respect and safety and consistency. And the people who offered me that were the ones I kept close. And when my mother eventually passed away, I was informed through a lawyer, and I mourned quietly, privately, and honestly, not for what we were, but for what we never became. And I forgave her fully, because forgiveness was not for her, it was for me. And I released the final hold her voice had on my identity, and I moved forward fully unburdened and free. And one evening, while organizing old files, I found a photo from years ago of myself standing alone at that party, holding a glass and looking smaller than I was, and I smiled softly at her. The woman I had been and whispered you survived, and then I shredded the photo and closed the file because my future no longer lived in the past, and today my life is calm, focused, and strong, built on truth, boundaries, and self-respect. And I know now that the sentence that ended everything was also the sentence that began my life, and I would say it again without hesitation, because walking away was not loss, it was liberation. And that is how my story ends, not with revenge, not with victory over others, but with peace earned through courage and silence chosen with strength, and that is enough. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.